Hello, OT friends, and welcome to the Uncommon OT series. I'm Patricia Modis, and I'm your host. A Filipino-American, native New Yorker, current California transplant, bulldog mama, and an uncommon occupational therapist myself for the past 22 years. On this podcast, you will hear me proudly feature the unique careers of occupational therapy practitioners working in non-traditional and role-emerging practice areas, settings where OT is uncommon. Be inspired as you listen to these up-close conversations and be energized and motivated to follow in these unconventional paths. Happy listening, friends. So today, I'm very excited to introduce you to our guest of honor, Dr. Mark Koch. Dr. Koch is an occupational therapist and educator whose areas of interest include community-based practice, trauma-informed care, occupational injustice, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. He received his Bachelor of Science in Occupational Therapy from the University of Missouri and his Post-Professional Occupational Therapy Doctorate from St. Louis University. Prior to his appointment at Cedar Crest College, Dr. Koch was a clinical assistant professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. As an OT educator and scholar, Mark is interested in understanding how relational approaches to teaching and learning can optimize learner inclusion, participation, and socialization to the profession. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Mark Koch. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so thrilled that you're with us. Thank you for taking the time. I'm super excited to talk about the important OT work that you do. Before we delve into all the juicy details, as usual, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, perhaps a few of your favorite occupations.
Okay. Well, when I'm not teaching or reading about teaching, some of my favorite occupations include painting, roaming the countryside, looking for early American antiques, folk art, mid-century modern furniture. I love road trips. I'm especially fond of the Pennsylvania countryside, having moved here just about 7 months ago, because it's so beautiful. The buildings are so old, and it reminds me of my home in Missouri. So those are just a few of the things that I enjoy doing.
Oh, nice. Thanks so much for sharing. You and I have a few things in common, and I actually love this area in Pennsylvania called New Hope. Is it called New Hope?
Yeah, I'm about an hour from New Hope.
About an hour, but I've been there once, and I just thought it was lovely. I remember antiquing and just finding the architecture just really quite stunning.
Yes, it's inspiring for sure.
So I know you shared with me that you just moved. And you moved for a new post. So we'll talk a little bit more about that new position shortly. But can you share with us what motivated you to share or contribute to our podcast?
Well, I recently attended AOTA's national conference in San Antonio, and this podcast came up while I was visiting with my previous students from the University of Arkansas at a poster session, and I think maybe you have spoken with, I don't remember her name now. That's terrible, but I was talking to another educator about this podcast assignment that I had done, where the students followed a podcast over the course of the semester and then would reach out to the podcaster. Is that the term?
Yes, or the podcast host.
Okay, the host or hostess, and would try to figure out how the host was advocating for occupational therapy. So, was it for a certain population, a certain practice domain, and it was an assignment that really resonated with students. So you came
love
up.
that. Thank you so much. That's great to know. The conference was such an amazing experience for me this year too. This is my first year as a podcaster attending the conference, so a big a big part of my plan was to go there to really promote away and stop by every booth and try to meet as many uncommon OTs as I possibly could.
Did you meet some?
Oh my goodness, I met a lot, and I'm still waiting for a bunch of them to reach back out. I know it's been, everyone probably has to catch up on stuff after the conference, right? But quite a lot, and so interesting. I was just sharing this with another OT just yesterday that with all of the booths that I visited at the conference, most of them were academia booths, right? Schools from, all throughout the country. And 8 out of 10 times, I would say, whomever I spoke with, the OT that I spoke with there, who's somebody who's an educator or an academia, would respond to me by saying, "Oh, yeah, I can be on your show. This is what I'm doing." So, what I learned from that is that every educator out there is onto something else. There's always something else on the side that they're working on other than just, teaching, right?
Yeah.
There's a side something, and a lot of times that happens to be in common. So many interesting individuals. I'm so glad you found me, and your students found me,
Me
and
too.
and they brought us together because the work that you do is also something that resonates very much with me and the type of OT work that I did in New York. So maybe we can delve into that a little bit now. Would you
Sure.
mind talking about the uncommon OT work that you do, and perhaps the setting that you practice and the needs that you're addressing?
Okay. Sure. And this was a while back, but I co-founded a community-based nonprofit back in the 90s in mid-Missouri for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And I helped grow the program with a really amazing group of individuals who are committed to addressing violence against women in our community. And the program kind of grew by leaps and bounds. And I, didn't realize it at first, but over time, came to understand that a lot of the skills that I had learned in OT school and in my more traditional practice were really useful in a non-traditional setting.
Mm-hmm.
So, doing an occupational profile on someone who perhaps you needed to develop a partnership or a collaboration with, or using therapeutic self to build a relationship with another potential partner,
Mm-hmm.
using activity analysis to write a federal grant or to create a program. And, I did that work for about 5 years. And then I transitioned to a prosecuting attorney's office in Columbia, Missouri, where I worked for around 17 years as a victim advocate. So instead of reading medical charts, I read police reports and helped
Mm-hmm.
people navigate the justice system after a crime occurred.
Very interesting. So you were titled a victim advocate.
Yes.
So this was not necessarily a position designed for an occupational therapist.
No, but the skill set fits so nicely. And certainly people who are victims and survivors of crime experience occupational disruption and other, forms of occupational injustice, from
Mm-hmm.
deprivation to alienation and to imbalance. And my job was to help people renegotiate their roles while also understanding their rights as a crime victim whose case was moving through the justice system.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the victims and survivors I worked with were victims of domestic and sexual violence, but I also worked with child abuse victims. I worked with survivors of robbery, burglary, you name it.
Yes, because all of those
can certainly, or all of those kind of in my ears kind of have the same or very similar consequences, right? In terms of just trauma and how one might
Yeah.
kind of navigate life post that event.
Yeah. A loss of control, a loss of their maybe, temporary sense of purpose, um, their ability to or capacity to engage in health promoting occupations, or to engage in occupations that were meaningful. And
Mm-hmm.
then, some of the people that I worked with over the course of their criminal case, came to understand, um, kind of a new sense of who they were, or they took on maybe the role of a survivor.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them decided to engage in occupations related to the justice system.
Okay.
So, they became resource seekers. Some of them
Mm-hmm.
eventually became advocates. Um,
I
and
love that.
yeah, and often I would help them um, write what was called a victim impact statement. So it was a statement that would help the judge, or a jury understand the impact that the crime had on them physically,
Wow.
emotionally, socially, occupationally, spiritually.
Wow. I, oh wow. I've never heard of such a thing, but as I'm hearing it, that could be such a healing process, and how amazing that there's an OT there to help guide somebody through developing that statement. I'm loving
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, it was really rewarding. And, sometimes when you work with children who are victims of crime and they don't have the power of
Mm-hmm.
words, then you help them draw a statement to show the judge maybe how the crime impacted their sense of safety and security.
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
in my experience, a lot of times that's such a difficult thing even for adults to describe, right? And there may be some insight developed as they're beginning to describe the impact. I've
yeah,
worked with survivors who have had a variety of just issues, right? And so most of the time, also cognitive issues as a result of head injuries, right? So oftentimes, maybe some confusion or just some disorganization, right? Or feeling easily overwhelmed. So these are all kind of things that can certainly impact one's ability to navigate the system and their everyday lives. So I think having an OT lens there to kind of recognize the needs.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I found I had a really, I didn't fully understand how useful my skill set would be until I started working in that environment. So, when we had cases that involved children, I could get out my OT bag of tricks from when I worked as a school-based practitioner and do activities that would help calm the child down, so that they could testify, or I could help a parent understand how the trauma would be impacting the child's occupations, their
Mm-hmm.
development. I could also, help articulate to a prosecuting attorney was who would be taking a case forward, how that crime had impacted that individual. And
Mm-hmm.
most people, I mean, what I found is most people either don't know what their rights are, or they assume that they have rights that they don't have. And
Yes.
so when you experience a loss of control, you really want to get that control back. My role was to um, help them understand that they weren't alone, and that
Mm-hmm.
often what they were experiencing was, while it was uncomfortable, it was normal. I mean, and maybe, even unpleasant, but, really help them understand that they didn't have to navigate the system alone, and then help them get connected with resources in the community that might help restore them financially, physically,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, and then worked with a whole team of, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, probation officers, community-based advocates. We had a in Columbia, Missouri. We had it was called the Domestic Violence Enforcement Unit. So we had
Mm-hmm.
a federally funded team that would follow women who were victims and survivors through a case from the investigation through the disposition, and we would be supporting her every step of the way and pointing her in one direction, not 10 different directions, as what often happens.
That's wonderful. Again, such important work that you're doing, providing the needed support, right? The kind of support that's needed, because you can provide support, but if it's not what they need, it's not really going to be effective. And particularly providing the resources, right? So this is going to reduce, hopefully, the recidivism, right? This whole idea of the cycle just sort of continuing on its own without any hope of it sort of just bringing, or without there being any hope for safety, right? Or long-term safety.
Yeah, the whole point of the initiative was to create a coordinated community response. So, we had a team that had a lot of respect for each other, and we developed policies and protocols that were evidence informed, that were very client centered, and also very relationship centered, because when you experience a crime, it makes you feel disempowered and disconnected from yourself and from your community. And so I think we had a really innovative approach, and a multidisciplinary approach. And I felt very, even though I was a bit of a fish out of water, I felt like I was very supported, and I could articulate that occupational perspective, and people were open to it.
Yes.
It made sense.
Yes. I want to hear more about the interdisciplinary work that came into play, and particularly later when we talk about the sort of what a typical session was like.
Okay.
But before we do, I want to kind of take a couple of steps back, because here you are doing this super great, important work. You went to OT school. How did you bridge both? How did you get from OT school to doing this type of work? Because I think that's what our listeners also want to get a glimpse about, right? It's what path did you take to get there?
Well, I wish I could say it was totally intentional. It was a little bit accidental. So when I graduated from OT school from the University of Missouri back in 1995, I worked at a state hospital, and I worked with men who'd committed violent crimes, but who were also found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. They also had histories of trauma and victimization and marginalization. But, when I worked at the state hospital, the occupational therapists only worked primarily on work skills and sheltered workshop skills. And to me, that was important, but not necessarily meaningful work for me. And so, I did different kinds of programs. I had an art group. I had a community reintegration group. I had an emotional regulation group. I put in my time and at the state hospital, and then I worked for a large nonprofit in mid-Missouri, and I was a contract therapist for 8 rural school districts. And I saw some kind of similar themes where I saw OTs doing a lot of handwriting, but for me, handwriting wasn't those weren't handwriting related questions, weren't the big questions I went to OT school to answer. And I saw children, also kind of being forced in some ways to work on handwriting when handwriting was also not a meaningful occupation, for them. I didn't have the justice related language at the time, but it just didn't sit well with me. And so, I was really dissatisfied with how I saw occupational therapists functioning in those environments and maybe not questioning the status quo. And just around that time, someone from our community approached me about joining a fledgling board of directors that was going to be looking at services for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and I have this inability to say no. I really wanted this very persuasive woman who I didn't know to like me. And the next thing I knew, I was on the board and I was getting trained, and I was a volunteer crisis line operator. I helped facilitate some support groups, and the next thing you know, we had a federal grant, and it seemed like a good time to transition from the school-based practice that wasn't very meaningful to this new area that once I got training and started to understand power dynamics in relationships, this idea that not all caregivers were helpful, that they could actually be hostile.
Yes, and re-traumatizing, in fact.
Yeah, and this idea of male privilege. Not knowing that you have certain privileges based on your sex, your gender, your sexuality, your ethnicity is in itself a privilege. And I found the work really energizing and challenging. It forced me to question a lot of taken for granted assumptions that I had made about life in general, and things I never even thought about in terms of occupational therapy. So I found it really growth fostering, frustrating at times, overwhelming, but really meaningful. And I just stuck with it.
Oh, I love that. Thanks for sharing with us how you bridge that gap from OT school to doing this type of work. Would you mind describing to us what a typical day might have been like for you in this role, or a typical session?
Yeah. It just depended on who came through the door or who called the crisis line, or maybe if I would get a call from our local circuit clerk or law enforcement agency saying that there was someone in their office, they were requesting help. And when I was working for the nonprofit, we had really strong partnerships with all the agencies, organizations, and people that victims and survivors might make contact with. And so then they would, with the survivor's permission, contact our organization, and we would meet them where they were, as long as it was physically safe place, and assess their needs, figure out what their priorities were, what mattered most to them, and then took it from there. So for some women, it was temporary shelter. For others, it was an order of protection. It always involved safety planning, because safety is a basic human need and a fundamental right.
Yes.
It might be accessing resources. It may be providing some basic education about power dynamics in relationships. It could be connecting that survivor with a counselor who we contracted with or who was a part of our organization. Okay. Or helping her understand really that she didn't deserve to be treated the way that she'd been treated, and that she wasn't alone in this process, and that we would support her regardless of what she chose to do and what was important to her.
Yes.
That was in the community. When I was in the prosecuting attorney's office, I would show up for work and there would be 12 new files on my desk, and I would open up the files and start reaching out to various victims and survivors. And again, kind of the same process, trying to figure out, introducing myself, and then just finding out what they needed. And kind of going from there.
Would the sessions typically take place in the office, like sort of on an outpatient basis? They would come in. How often?
So all of our services were free, and we never refused a walk-in, because we never knew, if people had transportation, or how many steps it took for them to walk into the courthouse and up to the third floor and to the prosecuting attorney's office to ask for help. So, we would just assess safety. I would always check to see if we had an active case, or if this person was working with other agencies in the community, and then, really just try to connect that individual to other resources, and again to like let them understand their rights. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I use the occupational therapy skills, but it probably didn't look like a typical OT session. You know, I
Yeah.
would do many occupational profiles and
Mm-hmm.
kind of take on more of a consultative role.
Mm-hmm.
The the caseload was, you know, sometimes I'd be working with 100 people at the same time,
Okay.
over the course of 6 months or a year or however long it took to for the prosecution to take place. So, you
Mm-hmm.
know, you really got to see people change and adapt and um, sometimes go back,
Yeah. Well, it
you
sounds
know?
like you're meeting them exactly where they were at. And that's, sort of the first thing that kind of came to my mind. Yeah, and that's why it's hard to really kind of predict or even plan or talk about a typical session because everyone is in such a different place and
Yeah.
everyone's story is so
Yeah.
different.
And, you know, some people would say, you know what? No, thank you. I don't want to be a part of the prosecution.
Hmm.
And that was okay,
Yeah.
you
They
know?
still receive, they can still receive services anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
their capacity to receive services wasn't dependent on them cooperating
Hmm.
with, you know, the justice system. That's not the case in every community, but that was the case in our office.
Okay. And it sounds like most of the work was one on one, no group work or any kind of support groups.
No, it was either one on one or in tandem with the prosecuting attorney
Hmm.
who, you know, if there was an active criminal case, the prosecuting attorney would also want to meet with the victim who was not just a victim, but like the primary witness in the state's case against the offender. And
Hmm.
so, you know, showing them the courtroom, if they were a child, letting them sit where the judge sat and ask questions and become
Hmm.
acclimated to that environment because at some point they might have to testify. And we wanted to make sure that, you know, we weren't harming the person in the process of trying to hold the offender accountable.
Hmm.
But there's always that potential.
Yes. So did this role exist before you created it?
I mean, the role in the community did not exist, but in the prosecuting attorney's office, the I replaced a social worker who had been there for about a decade,
Hmm.
and um, but you know, the difference was that I had this occupational perspective,
Yes.
and yeah, I'd say one of the first things that we looked at was, or I looked at because I'm an OT is, you know, so how what is our structure and process within the organization, and does it support or does it thwart participation from the victim or the survivor?
Hmm.
And you know, we were able to um, reconfigure or redesign our process so that we were responding to victims and their families much quicker than they had been previously, you know, just by asking someone to take a file and bring it to an advocate before bringing it to the prosecuting attorney.
Okay.
So I could make much quicker contact, assess needs, and really help that person understand what to expect in terms of the
Hmm.
justice system. You know, we often have systems that create a lot of friction for people
Yes.
because they're not client centered
Hmm.
and they're not timely.
Yes.
So you know, that was another way that I think my occupational perspective was useful in just, you know, taking that process and breaking it down into uh, its components and looking at how we might be able to adapt that to enable that person to have more choice, a louder voice,
Hmm.
um, a, a greater capacity to participate, which is all really critical to recovery, to healing, you know, to feeling like you matter.
Yes. And
Simple but
and
powerful.
yeah. And building the resilience that's needed to kind of move forward, right? And plug along.
For sure.
So again, the work that you're doing is so important. And, I particularly with this population, they're They're a population that's typically pushed down or oppressed. Even asking questions are not welcome, right? So,
Right.
coming up with the vocabulary, coming up with the confidence, coming up with all of these things are such important skills to help folks, master, right? And
Yeah.
really, and so that they can navigate these environments in a more and just a way where they feel like they're getting supported and they're actually moving forward, because I think that's also one other piece is you feel very stuck in these environments because again there's a lack of information, there's lack of access to things, right? And particularly with this population, domestic violence survivors or survivors of sexual assault, there's there's layers and layers of things, right? There's a lot of fear, particularly when it comes to those involved in the justice system. I know that there's a lot of fear in relationship to police officers and even just seeking out help, even medical services, right? So I love that you're there with your lens to recognize where some of these fears may be and to
Yeah.
really understand how to help folks move forward.
And we created, in some ways, the systems. When you're not looking at the systems and the structures in a critical way, you're creating the problems that you say that you're trying to mitigate.
Yes.
So if we don't respond in a timely way, it creates more disconnection and more disempowerment.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, it just and also I think what was useful was working on a multidisciplinary team, and looking at the policies that we were really enacting at the street level.
Mm-hmm.
You have laws and policies and you think
Yes.
that they're kind of out there, but really, when you're on the front lines, you're a street level bureaucrat.
Yeah.
You have a lot of power.
Yes.
And so with that, there's a lot of responsibility and so, you really can, enact, powerful policies just at the micro level. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think I was aware of that either for a
Yeah.
while.
I think, even just helping boost one's self-esteem, right? Or helping one feel like maybe a better parent in these scenarios can really go very, very far.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it really doesn't, a lot of people don't feel like they matter.
mm-hmm.
Um, and for legitimate reasons.
Yes. Or because maybe they've been told, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And they've tried to,
Repeatedly.
yeah. And they've tried to engage with a system that reinforces that
Yes.
experience. And it really just starts with, it's just some really simple questions of what do you need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What
And
matters to
also,
you?
yeah, and also not asking nonsensical questions, right? Questions that are just, I don't know, demographically based, like just things that are just, you can find that written down somewhere, right? So being really purposeful and intentional also in your approach. This might be a good way to segue into our next question, which really kind of relates to just some recent challenges or lows that you may have experienced in this role or experienced then in this role, and
Yeah.
some successes or highs in relation to
Okay.
this role.
Um, I would say one of the highs was eventually becoming the president of the Missouri Victim Assistance Network. It was, a network of service providers in Missouri that advocated on behalf of all crime victims. They were historically responsible for the state of Missouri adopting its crime victims' rights legislation. And so it was a real privilege and an honor to be a part of that board of directors and then to be the president of the organization and to put together statewide training, and inviting occupational therapists from the University of Missouri, for example, to present at that conference. They actually presented on head injury and concussion because
Oh,
many of the people you
fantastic.
work with, have undiagnosed head injuries
Yes.
that impacts their engagement and their
Yes.
performance and their health and well-being.
Yeah. Or
So, I
even
mean,
just
that
making
was
it to the appointment, right?
right, right. Yeah. And, so that was really exciting, inviting them to a child advocacy center to look at how perhaps the occupational therapists could have a role at a child advocacy center. So when there's an allegation of abuse and a child goes in for a forensic interview, they could immediately get a consultation with an occupational therapist. At least this was my dream.
Yes.
Uh, and the occupational therapist could then help the non-offending caregiver understand how that abuse might be impacting that child's occupations,
Got
um,
it.
and being able to help the occupational therapist see that other occupational therapists see their potential role. I would say though, the one not one there were many challenges, but probably the biggest challenge, and I sort of alluded to this when we spoke previously, is that I left a little bit too much up to chance in terms of my own well-being. So,
These are really tough environments.
yeah, yeah, and the work will change you in positive and negative ways, and ways you don't really understand until you perhaps experience your own, challenges in your life. So,
Yeah.
I realized that I hadn't done a good job of taking care of myself when my mother passed away unexpectedly. And I didn't realize I didn't really have the capacity to grieve because I didn't have any energy left to give to that process. I
Yes.
think, people around me saw it, but I wasn't going to be slowed down, you
Yeah.
know, and I did leave too much up to chance and kind of thought everything would just sort of fall into place because I'm a healthcare worker and I'm stoic.
Yes. I can relate to everything that you're saying. It's yeah, and it's it's when you're immersed in the work too, right? And I always pride myself in having firm boundaries, and I leave work and that's that, and I'm doing me, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to leave some of this stuff at work,
Yeah.
and it's there. We experience it, we live it, right? So super important. How did you manage? What did you? I know you're no longer in that post.
Yeah.
You were there for 17 years, you said, right? How what were
Yeah.
some things that you think you put into place that allowed for you to stay there for 17 years?
Well, I mean, really, we talk a lot about client-centered care. I like to focus on relationship-centered care. Like, I really feel like everything that I did was a co-occupation in some way. So I was doing the work with administrators, with judges, with law enforcement officers, with prosecutors and detectives. And it took a lot of coordination of our intentions and our emotions. It required us to be present and, really, they made it possible, those
Yeah.
really meaningful relationships, and that kind of sense of shared purpose and meaning that we
Yes.
had in the work.
Yeah.
So, that's one thing I think that sometimes we take that for granted is, when you hear a lot of people who tell stories of doing things, out of the box, at least for me, I guess I shouldn't say a lot of people, but, it was only possible because I had a really good support system in place and surrounded myself with people who were effective and who I could coordinate my emotions and intentions with, not all the time, um, but really creating environments and relationships that support resilience, to borrow your
Yes.
word.
Yeah, and resilience on all systems, right? All systems levels, because when you're doing this type of work that is so required, your team has to get the self-care, right?
Yeah.
There has to be that healing portion of the work too for the
Yeah.
team.
And that's what we saw each other as people. I mean, I think that was part of whenever a new member came into the team, I would take that person out to lunch. I would tell them kind of these are the policies. These are sort of the unwritten policies.
Mm-hmm.
This is the history. This is what you need to do to position yourself for success in the work.
Yes.
I was lucky I had someone who did that for me when I got involved in the work. And we've stayed friends over, all these years. And so I just tried to help the next person,
And particularly because it was so helpful to you at the time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And even when I had students, they would come in, to the prosecuting attorney's office. And the first thing I would do is show them how information moved within the office so that they could get that process. But then also talk about, the written policies and also some of the unwritten policies about, just what they needed to really be purposeful and intentional in their work. Try to get
were these OTD students?
No, unfortunately not. I supervised actually the law students and I supervised social work students. And I would very occasionally get a level 1 fieldwork student who would come in and spend a week with me. They would follow cases and, by the end they were totally hooked. They loved it. They loved the idea that nobody's counting billable units.
Yeah.
Progress is measured very fluidly. The documentation requirements were very different than a traditional setting because, my notes could be discoverable, which meant a defense attorney could get their hands on them if they requested. Yeah. So my notes were very minimal. I mean, there were some
for the protection of the clients that you served. Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't have to, in my opinion, deal with some of the things that are energy draining in traditional settings.
Yes.
And that was really intentional. I mean, my sister's an occupational therapist. She chose a much more traditional path. I knew I wanted something different. I didn't know quite what I wanted, but I just knew I didn't want to be tethered to traditional healthcare because I found that it in many ways can be very challenging to work in a way that's in sync with your values.
Yes. Can we switch gears towards money matters? I know you mentioned earlier federal grants, right?
Yeah.
How is this program supported?
So both of my positions were paid for through federal grants. One was paid for through the Victims of Crime Act, which is Reagan federal legislation, Reagan era legislation. And then the other position was funded through the Violence Against Women Act. And to be honest, I had no history, no skills really writing grants before I took the job. But, and I think I'd mentioned this before, in an earlier conversation, one of the first things I did was I figured out where the money was coming from, who's paying for these services and how do I figure out what the process is? And so, one of the first things I did was I volunteered to serve on a grant review committee for our Department of Public Safety. And so I read the very grants that I was eventually going to be writing. And I learned the rubric that they were using, to weigh certain parts of the grant. And then I also got to know the people who were reading the grants. I mean, really get to make connections with these state workers who sometimes had 2 jobs and who were really passionate about, the work that they were doing, but didn't have a lot of power or influence beyond, maybe in their own administrative roles, but certainly in terms of the decisions that they made. And, that's how I learned the system, by reading grants and going, I think I can do that maybe 5% better than I set my bar a little low, probably. And then whenever we met, during a grant cycle, I would take the best snacks. So
Such brilliant advice. Brilliant advice.
Simple but powerful, like home really really good donuts from the family bakery in Fulton, Missouri,
Oh my gosh, that sounds
not from the
delicious.
chain.
I used to bring in cupcakes. I was the cupcake queen at work.
Huh?
I used to bring in cupcakes. Actually, this was every time a student would leave because we often had a rotation of students. So it was basically a treat. And, but it wasn't just a treat for the students, but it also became a treat for the staff.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it just became a really nice tradition. So
yeah,
I'm all for food and using that as a way to touch others, right?
exactly. Exactly. Again, like sharing a meal or a snack or something with other people,
Yes.
you know,
S-
another
Something
co-occupation.
about absolutely the act of breaking bread together, right? Just sitting in a same space and sharing, and there's so much of that is so meaningful.
Yeah, I didn't understand that. I didn't understand those things in OT school. I didn't get those opportunities, but when um, so I think someone had shared that advice with me. That probably wasn't my original idea, was to bring good snacks, but it was again, simple but powerful way of making a connection with people.
Yes. So thank you so much for all of this wonderful information that you shared with us. Do you have any additional career advice for any of our listeners who might be interested in pursuing something similar? I know that you've already given us tidbits here and there.
Yeah. Well, I would say be patient, be intentional, um, see things fluidly, and remember that you don't have to do this by yourself. One person can't sustain a movement. That's something that we used to say all the time. I would forget that quite often, but um, maybe you piggyback. I've actually been talking with someone right now who wants to get into human trafficking work, and I said, piggyback off of a organization that's already providing the services. Go to a statewide training, get to know who the players are in your community, and build a relationship with them. And figure out where the money's coming from.
Yes.
I think a lot of people assumed wrongly that I did this work on a volunteer basis. And, while I'm very passionate about the work, I also need to be paid. Um, but I wrote my own ticket. I figured out how to do it and how to pay myself. Maybe I didn't make quite what an OT would make, but there were other benefits that
Yes.
were worth the trade-off.
Yeah.
And then I would just say that, and this is to borrow, Florence Clark, we become what we practice. So see everything that you do as an opportunity to practice your future practice. And
Yes.
just take time to have conversations, because some of the best things that have happened in my career were because of a conversation. So never pass up that opportunity to connect with somebody around an idea or a process, or um, see those. You never know. Everything matters and everybody matters.
Absolutely. Well, such great advice. Lastly, are there any common myths or misconceptions about the work that you do that you'd like to call out today?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest one is, and maybe this has probably changed, is, people would say to me all the time, "You're not really doing OT though. That's not real
Haha.
occupational therapy practice." And I would say, "Well, you tell me your definition of OT and I'll tell you mine."
Yes.
You know, our occupation is for everyone, because everyone is an occupational being. And so we have this potential to be of service to anyone, or to everyone and anyone. And,
Yes.
I would just say, look for those connections to occupation. They're there. They might be hidden, but they're there. Think critically. Don't accept the status quo, and use your resources, even if you aren't fully aware that they're out there.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to wrap up by having you talk to us a little bit about your new role. And I love that you have this new role. I mean, I loved your previous role, but I think it's so important that you share everything that you've learned and all of your experiences in that role to future OTs. So would you mind sharing with us a little bit about that and kind of, how did you segue into this role now?
Well, I needed a new challenge. And a lot of what we do as occupational therapists involves teaching and learning. And so, part of the reason why I transitioned was I had a timely conversation with Tim Wolf from the University of Missouri, and he said, "Hey, if you want to go back to school and get your OTD to teach, do it now. Don't wait." And so I did. So I teach at Cedar Crest College. It's a small liberal arts college in Allentown, Pennsylvania. I've been here about 8 months. I'm also now the doctoral capstone coordinator.
Congratulations!
Thank you. I love the teaching part. I'm still learning about all the roles of an educator that I didn't really fully understand when I was studying. Just the administrative part. Sometimes that's a little much, but what we want to do here in our program we're trying to give students a wide range of experiences so that they can see that, if they want to work in healthcare, that's great, but they don't have to be tethered to healthcare. Yes. And we don't necessarily want them to do what we did. We want them to develop their own knowledge and skills in an area that they're passionate about, and then take it in a new direction. So I feel very fortunate. Our program director, Bill Reitzman, has been really, I'm going to get choked up now. He's been really intentional about building a diverse team and incredibly supportive and mindful about the kind of culture he's creating. And we are working hard to demonstrate the behaviors that we want our students to take on once they become occupational therapists, to be curious, to be critical, and to be leaders and be collaborators.
Oh, wow. You are so inspiring to me. I'm so happy you're in this role. You're much needed in this role. You will exude to all of the students that you touch, the type of thoughtfulness and just intentionality into the work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel very lucky to have crossed your path. When we spoke previously, I had no idea that you and I had such similar experiences.
Yes. Yeah.
So thank you for creating a venue for people to share their stories and for people to, future occupational therapists to understand that there are all kinds of possibilities out there. They just have to go out and sometimes create them or, at very least explore them.
Yes. Every time I speak with another OT, it's someone else doing something that I've never, ever heard of before that is just incredible. And, I aspire to be that OT, so, but I know I'm running out of time. But again, thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your journey, for sharing with us just the important work that you do, and for, just giving us a glimpse on how it can be done. I think this is exactly what this podcast is all about. It's to spark that interest in future OTs or current OTs who are practicing, who may be feeling a bit frustrated and stuck, right? That there are these options and it's limitless.
Yeah, it is. Well, thank you.
Thank you too.
And that wraps up another inspiring episode of the Uncommon OT series. Connect with me at www.transitionsot.com. And don't forget to sign up to be part of the Transitions OT community. By doing so, you'll receive my latest compiled list of uncommon OT practice settings, the latest news on mentoring offerings, uncommon OT live events, non-traditional OT resources, and more. You may also follow me on my social media pages on Instagram and LinkedIn. And if you love this episode, head on over to Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, and Google Podcasts to follow, rate, and leave a review. I also ask you to consider pledging your support to my Passion Podcast project by being a patron on Patreon. It is very much appreciated. Sending big OT love. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.